questions remain about the origins and the nature of the unidentified objects shot out of the sky last week. U.S. officials have confirmed that at least 2 belong to China, but an Aviation Week report published on Thursday maintains the balloon that's MIA could in fact belong to a hobby club called the Northern Illinois Bottle Cap Balloon Brigade. Sounds very threatening. According to Aviation Week, the hobby club reported that the last known position of the party-style balloon was at 40,000 feet off the west coast of Alaska on February 10th.
The Chinese balloon saga took center stage in the first meeting between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and China's top diplomat since the incident, which the China representative called, quote, nearly hysterical. Here to discuss Washington's reaction to the unidentified flying objects is Jake Werner, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. Welcome, Jake.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. Now, we have been talking about this in the disproportionate, arguably, reaction to it. The fact that missiles that are valued an incredible sum are used to shoot what might ultimately just be kind of hobbyist projects out of the sky. What do you make of both the level of reaction and from the state and also the level of reaction from the media?
I think the Biden administration has been relatively responsible in the way that it responded to this, although shooting down $50 hobbyist balloons with several $100,000 missiles maybe was an overreaction. But the larger political context for this has been deeply irresponsible, and it has probably created the environment in which the Biden administration felt like it had to overreact in the way that it did. But more importantly, it sort of signals where we're at in the U.S. China relationship, that there are essentially no voices in Washington arguing for a responsible relationship with China. And that kind of imbalance in the way that Washington is regarding China is really dangerous. The media, I think, they kind of picked up this story and ran with it. It's sensationalist. It's kind of funny. It's kind of threatening at the same time. It's kind of like media gold. I wish that the media would focus on things that actually are dangerous to the American people or that are real opportunities for the American people. But that's not always the logic on which the media operate. And I think the media kind of take their signals from what's going on in Congress and in the political debate in Washington. So that's probably the place that we need to look to try to change things and put things on a better track.
Well, Secretary Blinken also hit China's diplomat on his country's involvement in the war between Russia and Ukraine, namely how it might supply Russia with weapons. While Blinken rebuked any help Beijing extends to the Kremlin, China fiercely denied such accusations. A spokesperson shot back, saying, quote, "We do not accept the United States finger-pointing on China-Russia relations, let alone coercion and pressure."
Despite China's denial, trade data shows the Kremlin is using Chinese drones in its war with Ukraine. According to the Wall Street Journal, Russia is putting some of these commercial drones to use on the battlefield to target Ukrainian forces, a major concern for the Pentagon. Now, Jake, you wrote an article earlier this month that you believe there should be a responsible relationship with China. I think that you also just made reference to that a little while ago. What does that mean, and why is it important as there continues to be these kinds of escalations between the two countries, either real or imagined?
Yeah, well, the Biden administration has been pursuing a policy that is overwhelmingly about what it says is competition with China. Many of the measures that the administration has been pursuing or that Congress is pushing to enact into law, many of them are prudent measures to take in a context of a growing power of China. We don't really know how China will use that power. It's quite responsible, I think, to hedge against bad possibilities there. The thing that is really deeply irresponsible is to make that the only way in which we're interacting with China, right? So this imbalance between a deterrent posture or a balancing posture on the one hand, and the inability to show China that there is a world in which the United States wants China to exist. That imbalance is sending the signal to China not that the United States is being prudent, but that the United States is preparing or is already containing China, trying to keep it down, trying to exclude it from what the Chinese leadership considers China's rightful place in the global system. That is leading to China's responses to these kinds of measures in ways that are that are generally unconstructive. That in turn sends the signal to American leaders that China is irresponsible. So we get a kind of escalating dynamic where the imbalance in the relationship is getting worse and worse as each side becomes more and more convinced that the other is going to be its enemy and therefore has to prepare for that. The danger here is that we end up, the worst danger is we end up in a war. That's a very real possibility given how explosive the issue of Taiwan is. But even if we manage to avert that, and the road that we're on right now, it's not looking great. But even if we manage to avert the worst consequences of this, nonetheless, if we get into a situation where the U.S. and China are facing each other in a relationship of permanent hostility, then each one is going to be undermining and sabotaging what the other wants to accomplish. And generally speaking, there are a lot of interests that are shared between the two countries that are just going to get thrown out the window as the two sides prepare for conflict.
And how concerned should the U.S. be, or what even should U.S. policy response be to, this allegation of Russia and China working closely together, China supplying Russia with weapons?
I think that the problem here is not the steps that the Biden administration is taking. Signaling to China that this would be unacceptable, that's fine. Signaling that there are going to be consequences, that's fine. As long as that's done in a very clear way about where U.S. red lines are and what the consequences would be for crossing them, that's fine. But in the context of a deeply imbalanced approach to China, in which the only thing that the administration can say to China is that we don't like this that you're doing, we don't like that you're doing, China is not going to be responsive to that kind of a message, number one. And number two, the deepening of this kind of antagonism between the two sides is extremely, extremely dangerous. It pushes us closer and closer to a situation where the two countries really orient their entire foreign policy, if not their entire societies, around confronting the other one.
Jake, I'm really troubled. I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around the idea of these two countries confronting each other, of there actually being an escalation that could even threaten or hint at war with a country as resourced and as populous as China. We talk about this in the context of Ukraine, Russia, that whatever resolution you want, obviously I think most people are looking for a peaceful resolution, the idea that Ukraine is going to overpower Russia by brute military force is naive. At the same time that I imagine a conflict between the United States and China, I'm not really placing bets on that one. And I'm similarly coming to it from a position of avoidance at all cost. And I'm concerned that the way we're talking about this doesn't seem to reflect that orientation. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Do you get the feeling that people are engaging with this issue with a full understanding of what it would mean for the world, for there to be an open hostilities between countries like the United States and China?
No, not at all. It's all very abstract. It's like moving around pieces on a chessboard. The reality is that we don't know what would happen. At a minimum, any real conflict between the U.S. and China, military conflict, would involve the death of thousands of people on both sides. Some of the war games that have been done, sort of trying to project what might happen, involve the sinking of numerous aircraft carriers, American aircraft carriers, and there are thousands of people on each aircraft carrier. So you can imagine, even if we were very lucky and came out of this and the war remained relatively limited, we're still talking about the death of thousands of people, a permanent state of hostility between the two countries. And if the conflict took place over Taiwan, then it would absolutely devastate this wonderful country of Taiwan. So for those who want to safeguard Taiwan, for those who are concerned about Chinese actions, the only way to solve any of this stuff is to make sure that we don't get into that kind of a conflict. Instead, people are rushing into, like, how do we beat China if we're in a war with China? If that's the discussion, we've already lost. We've already, not just the United States, not just Taiwan, not just China, but the entire world, because even beyond the immediate consequences, it would be a complete catastrophe for the global economy, and it would destroy the lives of literally millions of people. We've seen like a sort of shadow version of that with the Russia-Ukraine version. It would be 10 times, 100 times worse if the U.S. and China were fighting each other.
Well, Fox News did reach out to NIB for comment, and NORAD told Fox News Digital that the FBI has spoken with the Hobby Club and expects the National Security Council to have more on potentially identifying the objects. We'll follow any updates here. Jake Werner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.